Hi, Mrs. Colgan here again with the final chapter of the Wednesday Wars, June. Mrs. Baker hated camping. You could tell this because her eyes rolled whenever the subject came up, which was plenty lately, since that's what her class was going to do to celebrate the end of the school year. 2 nights of camping up in the Catskill Mountains, beside a waterfall, in deep woods. On soggy ground, said Mrs. Baker. It'll be great, said Danny. With mosquitoes, said Mrs. Baker. Mosquitoes, said Merrill. Sleeping on rocks, said Mrs. Baker. Terrific, I said. Dew all over us, said Mrs. Baker. Great, said Doug Switek. Let's get back to sentence diagramming, said Mrs. Baker. You might wonder why Mrs. Baker was going to take us camping when she thought that camping meant soggy ground, mosquitoes, sleeping on rocks, and dew. But every year since she had first begun to teach at Camillo Junior High, Mrs. Baker had taken her class camping in June. Lieutenant Baker had come along, probably because he loved camping, and Mrs. Baker was willing to put up with soggy ground, mosquitoes, sleeping on rocks, and dew for his sake. Maybe she wanted to go this year because he would have wanted to go. Maybe she thought that if she kept every routine the same, then he really would be home in time for strawberries. So Mrs. Baker was taking us camping, even though she hated camping. But let me tell you, Mrs. Baker would have had to hate camping a whole lot more to keep herself from smiling through all of her classes. Even when she was rolling her eyes or crossing her arms or fussing that Mr. Van Larry had still not gotten up all the spilled cider mopped up so that it was sticky on the feet when you walked into the coat room. She was still smiling anyway because Lieutenant Baker was coming home. It was all in the papers. It was in all the papers. Even Walter Cronkite talked about it on the 6:30 news. How Lieutenant Baker's helicopter was shot down, how he jumped out before the helicopter hit the ground and shattered, how his leg was caught by one of the broken blades, how he hid in the jungle near Khe Sanh trying to keep his wound clean and eating chocolate bars from his pack, how he followed a river until he couldn't go any further, how he was found by a woman who already had 2 sons killed and didn't want anyone else to die, so she took him back to her house. How he hid there for 3 months until an American helicopter came over and he signaled, and how the crew pulled him out. It was, said Walter Cronkite, a miraculous rescue. I guess it's like Prospero pulling back the curtain for the king, and there's Prince Ferdinand, who the king thought was dead, playing chess with Miranda like he was on vacation. Or maybe a little like a phone call late at night from your sister, who isn't all that interested in finding herself anymore. She just wants to find you. So Mrs. Baker was smiling because no one can help smiling at miracles. The camping trip was going to be on Thursday and Friday of the second week of June. Everything before that, said Mrs. Baker, would be work. Work like we had never known work. Work that would make us drop. Work that would make us beg for mercy. It was hard to worry too much about this since she was smiling the whole time she said it. But she really did work us like we had never been worked before. Sentence diagramming, short stories by John Steinbeck, the spelling and construction of adverbs and adjectives with Latinate endings, declining strong verbs, more short stories by John Steinbeck, who wrote a whole lot of short stories, and an essay report on any 3 poems written before 1900, because Mrs. Baker thought that no one had written any poems worth writing about since then. All this in 2 weeks, and that doesn't count Mr. Petrelli's Westward Expansion and You report, or Mr. Samowitz's pre-algebra final examination. And it didn't count Much Ado About Nothing, which should have counted for the whole shebang since it advertised itself as a comedy, but let me tell you, it wasn't. Of course it's not always funny, said Mrs. Baker. Why would you ever imagine that a comedy has to be funny? Mrs. Baker, if it's a comedy, it's supposed to be funny. That's what comedies are. No, Holling, said Mrs. Baker. Comedies are much more than funny. And she smiled again. Whatever it was supposed to be much more than, Much Ado About Nothing wasn't funny. Maybe a line or two here and there, but other than that, pretty much not funny. I mean, talk about jerks. Claudio and Hero, Shakespeare wasn't all that good about his names. Claudio and Hero would have had a whole lot to do just to get up to where Romeo and Juliet were. First they're in love, then they're not in love, and Hero has to pretend to die. Does this sound familiar? Don't you think Shakespeare needed some new material? And Claudio has to pine away at her tomb, and then Hero has to come back to life, and then they fall in love again, just like that. Really? Can you believe this stuff? Because you don't have to be Shakespeare to know that's not the way it happens in the real world. In the real world, people fall out of love, little by little, not all at once. They stop looking at each other. They stop talking. They stop serving lima beans. After Walter Cronkite is finished, one of them goes for a ride in a Ford Mustang, and the other goes upstairs to the bedroom. And there is a lot of quiet in the house. And late at night, the sounds of sadness creep under the bedroom doors and along the dark halls. That's the way it is in the real world. It's not always smiles. Sometimes the real world is like Hamlet, a little scared, unsure, a little angry, wishing that you could fix something that you can't fix, hoping that maybe the something would fix itself, but thinking that hoping that way is stupid. And sometimes the real world is more like Bobby Kennedy, who was a sure bet for the Democratic nomination and probably would have been president of the United States and stopped the war, but who got shot at point-blank range. After she heard the news, my sister locked herself in her bedroom. She put on the Beatles singing Eleanor Rigby and played it over and over and over again, low, so that I could just barely hear it through her door. I knocked after something like the 50th repetition. Heather? No answer. The song started over. I knocked again, but she turned up the volume, and the Beatles sang about all the lonely people and wondered where they all came from, as if we didn't know. But I kept knocking until finally the music stopped and the door jerked open, and it looked for a moment like my sister was going to take my head off, but she didn't. Behind her, the Beatles sang of Father Mackenzie walking away with the dirt of a grave on his hands. I took Heather's hand, and we left the house together. We walked to St. Adalbert's. We waited on a long line to light 2 candles, and though we were both crying, everyone was crying, we kept holding each other's hands, and we said the same prayer. But it's not always miracles, as if we didn't know that too. Bobby Kennedy died the next morning. We heard it together on the transistor radio, Heather and me. She cried and I held her, gut crying, not knowing what it all to do except to be together. And if I hadn't heard that Lieutenant Baker was going to come home and that some miracles stand a chance of being real, I think I might have given up on the whole Presbyterian thing right then, sort of like Julius Caesar giving up on Brutus and going ahead and dying. Early the next Thursday morning, a bus pulled up to take Mrs. Baker's class to the Catskill Mountains. We taunted the other 7th graders going on into their classrooms. Then there was running onto the bus to pick out our seats, and a lot of running back out to help load the hot dogs and buns and chili and water bottles and juice powder mix and marshmallows and more marshmallows and loaves of bread and wool blankets for everyone and extra wool blankets for just in case, and then running onto the bus again to make sure that no one had stolen our seats, and then running out again to go to the bathroom one more time since the only bathrooms where we were going had branches on them. It took Mrs. Baker and Mr. Van Larry and even Mrs. Sidman, who was coming along with us to lend Mrs. Baker moral support, she said, to get us finally herded onto the bus. Then it bumped into gear and we were out onto Lee Avenue. We sang as we drove to the Long Island Expressway. We got to old Miss O'Leary, taking a lantern to her shed, and the flea on the fly, on the hare on the wart, on the frog, on the bump, on the log, in the hole in the bottom of the sea, and the bullfrog stubbing his toe and falling in the water. Then we reached the Throg's Neck Bridge, and Doug Switek started 1,000 bottles of beer on the wall until Mrs. Baker came down the bus aisle and didn't need to say anything. She had her arms crossed. A very ominous beginning. After an hour, the bus went from the highway to the thruway, then, an hour later, off a sharp exit to a 2-lane road, then to a gravel road, and then to a dirt road. Finally, we ended up on a 2-track path that the bus could never have gotten out of if the path didn't double back on itself. When we reached the end of that, and let me tell you, this took a while, we climbed out and Mrs. Sidman tried to keep us corralled together as Mrs. Baker issued a pack to each of us. The pack Mrs. Baker gave Danny was full of cans of chili, which weighed enough to make Danny stop smiling pretty quickly. The pack she gave me held 4 cans of chili, big cans of chili, and all the utensils. If something happens to this pack, she said when she hefted it onto my shoulders, we're all going to eat with our fingers. What could happen? I said. That is probably what Hero's father was thinking after the wedding date was set, she said, which, if you haven't read Much Ado About Nothing lately, was Mrs. Baker's way of saying that a whole lot could happen. In small groups, we followed Mrs. Baker onto a path that went mostly uphill while jutting up as many tree roots as it could to trip us. It wasn't too long before we were all stretched out, a long and straggling line that got longer and stragglier the farther we went. Still, it was a June day to be blithe and bonny in. The leaves up in the hills still had that fresh color they have when they're just a couple weeks old, and they give off that green smell that mixes so well with sunshine in June. A few big billows of clouds floated ahead of us. We could see them piled up when the maples thinned out to the birches, carried on winds that were way too high to reach us below the trees. Top branches rubbed together now and then, their creaking and cracking the only sound we heard, except for the group ahead that was singing about Napoleon's army of 50,000 men climbing up a hillside. They probably weren't carrying hefty cans of chili. I was the very last person on the path, and let me tell you, after a while, that bugged me. It wasn't that I was alone. Mrs. Sidman walked in front of me, picking up sweatshirts and canteens that hadn't been tied to the packs very well, and handing them to Danny and Merrill Lee when her arms got too full. But you put all the utensils for an entire class in one pack and 4 big cans of chili, and you're carrying quite a bit, and that's going to slow you down. And it was an old pack, and it smelled old. I had to keep hefting it back up around my shoulders because the straps wouldn't hold tight. And every time I did that, another fork or knife found a way to poke into my spine. And when you have to do that while you're climbing mostly uphill, and the straps of your backpack are cutting grooves into your shoulders, and Doug Switek is carrying a pack filled with bags of marshmallows, you don't get into the best of moods, even if it is a June day off from school.